there is this ultimate end. I mean, everybody's living for something. Everyone's looking for what's really going to make them happy. And then if we ask the question, well, what is that? Then we start to get into much deeper and bigger questions.
Welcome to Purposeful Lab, a Magis Center podcast. I'm Catherine Hadro with my co-host, Dr. Dan Keebler. Today, we're discussing the powers of the soul. Pretty profound topic.
Yeah, deep topic.
Yes. And with a guest who, he travels really around the nation giving talks on this subject, and that's Father James Brent. He's an assistant professor of philosophy at the Pontifical Faculty of the Immaculate Conception at the Dominican House of Studies here in Washington, D.C. This is my first time getting the chance to meet him and speak with him, but I've heard him speak on this online.
Yeah, I've heard a couple of his podcasts with the Thomistic Institute. So I'm looking forward to talking with him and asking him about the powers of soul, how this relates to what we've talked about with biological evolution of humans and sort of our psychological understanding of humans and consciousness and seeing how all this might fit together in the unity of the human person.
Yes. I should also mention Father Brent has a new book that's out, The Father's House, and it's really all these retreat talks he's given over the past 10 years. And anyways, I think his wisdom really comes through in this episode. So let's get to it. Here's Father James Brent on the powers of the soul. Father Brent, thank you so much for meeting with us today. It's a pleasure to have you on.
My joy. Happy to be here.
Thank you. Do you mind starting us off and telling us about your background, both, professionally and personally?
I was born and raised in Michigan, and as soon as I got to college, I knew I wanted to study philosophy, and I studied philosophy all the way through my undergraduate years, and I pursued a master's degree in philosophy, and then I went to St. Louis University, and that's where I worked on my doctorate, and I joined the Dominicans in 2004, and completed my doctorate in philosophy, and then went on to do theology studies at the Dominican House of Studies. And then I taught for a number of years at the Catholic University of America. And I've gone on the road preaching all over the country with fellow Dominicans. And I've taught at the Dominican House of Studies now for 7 years, and continue to travel and preach and teach in various ways through the Thomistic Institute and retreats for college students and young adults, and writing now, doing a lot of that. So
that's great. What drew you to the Dominicans, Father?
What drew me to the Dominicans was the marvelous combination of a life in common, full of prayer and sacred study. That's all ordered towards preaching for the salvation of souls. It's a unique combination in the life of the church, and it seemed to have all the elements that just suited me perfectly.
Yeah, that's great.
And again, you teach philosophy, and that will be, what our conversation is centered around is philosophy. But as a Dominican who has studied Thomas Aquinas, how would Aquinas distinguish philosophy and psychology and theology?
Oh, okay. So philosophy is the quest to understand reality as deeply as we can by the light of reason, okay? To understand the ultimate explanation, really the highest causes, as Aristotle or St. Thomas would say. Using the natural light of reason that all human beings have, just because we're human. Theology is the study of what God has revealed in a special way to the prophets of old, to the apostles in Christ, and that's contained in Scripture and handed on in the church. So those who believe in the divine revelation want to understand the divine revelation, because when you believe, you don't cease to be human and you don't cease to want to understand. So when we believe all that God has revealed to us, we want to understand it. And theology is the systematic quest to understand all that God has revealed. Okay? Or theology is the quest to understand all that God has revealed in a systematic kind of way. Psychology can be taken in a number of different senses. There is psychology in the ancient philosophical sense, which is really the study of soul, or the study of human beings in particular. But then there's a contemporary sense of psychology where we have the theoretical and clinical psychology that's used, that's really directed towards therapy in various ways. And that's more of a reflection upon experience in the attempt to use contemporary science to understand pathology in order to diagnose and treat it, unless you take another specific approach to psychology, which we call positive psychology, which doesn't focus on the abnormal, but on what is health overall, positively speaking, and then what does it take for human beings to flourish.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, this season we've been looking at all three of those, but particularly, we've been focusing on sort of this the uniqueness of humans. We clearly, we've talked about the evolution of hominids and humans and things that we sort of share with other primates. We've looked at like evolutionary psychology and sort of how that affects who we are and what it means for humans to flourish, given sort of our connection with other animals. But what is it, that we're trying to get at this season is what is it that makes humans unique or different? So what, from your perspective, from philosophical perspective, what is it that is the sort of linchpin? I think we have sort of biologically, you can sort of come up with some arguments, psychologically, you can come up with things, but what would you say, if somebody asked that?
Right. It's a very common thesis that's put forward in the sciences, certainly in biology, but other fields as well, that there's that when it comes to living things, there's a difference of degree, but not a difference of kind. So we should think of the world of life as this spectrum of accidental variation, but there's no essential differences between the various forms of life out there. Even the word form means something kind of different than what ancient philosophers understood it to mean, certainly what Aristotle understood it to mean. So we're all kind of educated into this worldview where there's really a spectrum between lower life and higher. Even calling it higher and lower is passé.
Right, exactly.
Because there's no hierarchy, and there is no higher and lower, and because there's no difference of kind. So one of the main things we need to sort of establish up front is that there is a difference in kind between human beings and other life forms, we might say lower life forms. How do we do that? Instead of looking for like one particular thing that's like the zinger that will establish it definitively, a better way to approach it, I think, is to step back and take our whole experience of human beings. And a simple exercise that anyone can do is just get out a piece of paper and start writing down what are some things that only human beings do? Or what are some things that only human beings can do? And it doesn't take long
to come
up with a long list. So you can say, well, only human beings have symphony orchestras. Not all human beings, but only human beings, as distinct from other life forms. So only human beings have symphony orchestras. Only human beings travel to the moon. Only human beings have legal systems. Only human beings have transportation system consisting of concrete roads and automobiles and the world of technology that we have. Only human beings build schools. Only human beings, use language, and we can specify more specifically what that means. Only human beings wear clothing. Only human beings, you just go down the list. Like only human beings dine. Only human beings make wine and beer. Like you can just go down the list. And it doesn't take long to come up with a pretty big list. And this list gets so big, you start to realize this really, really strongly suggests, and maybe more than suggests, it really reveals that there is a difference in kind between us and other life forms.
I think that's true. And just as a biologist, you get this sort of evolutionary view that the field's sort of immersed in that really focuses on, there are relationships that you have with these other species and organisms, but there is something that's unique, in terms of, you think, I think like the biomass of all humans on Earth dwarfs the biomass of all other major vertebrates. It's just that we have dominated, and spread to so many different places. There's something different about humans as a species than other species, that we do so many things that
sometimes philosophers try to zero in on one particular thing that really differentiates us from everything else. So for example, Augustine at one point zeroes in on the fact that human beings train other animals, but other animals don't train human beings.
Right.
So like sometimes you can zero in on some very special kind of phenomena. Or others, sometimes the fathers of the church focus on fasting.
Okay.
Like only human beings fast. like voluntarily
Right.
abstain
Yeah.
from
Yeah.
food at
Exactly.
certain
Yeah.
points, but lower animals don't fast. Other animals don't fast. So fasting is sometimes singled out as a very special phenomenon, or domesticating animals, or
Yeah.
training them in various ways is sometimes singled out. But I wouldn't put my stock in any
of them.
one of those.
Yeah.
But when you add them all together in a kind of cumulative case or cumulative observation, you can see that there's a pretty radical difference between human beings and other animal forms.
That's interesting that they picked like teaching other animals, because it's
Yeah.
also no other animal teaches in the way we do.
Right.
They all can learn, but actually we teach other,
Right.
our offspring and so forth in a very active way. Even. So that's
Well,
interesting.
I will say, I feel like my pets have trained me to
Right.
obey them in
Well,
some
I was
way.
just going to say in response to this, what you mean by teaching, there's a properly human way of teaching, and then there is a kind of animal teaching, but it's really more like conditioning. So animals can condition their young, and your animals could even, in a way, condition you, but that's different from teaching in the way that we teach one another.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's fascinating. And again, in this episode, we'll be looking at specifically the soul from a philosophical perspective, and really the powers of the soul. So just foundational question, what is a soul? And we've discussed all the, different kinds of living beings. Does every living being have a soul?
That's a great question. So if we consider the ancient philosophical tradition, in the ancient world, the word soul was used to describe what's responsible for life. So this is a different way of thinking about soul than we have become accustomed to in the modern world.
Mm-hmm.
And it is the way that the philosophers and theologians spoke up until the High Middle Ages, was they spoke in terms of soul as the principle of life. So wherever you find life on this ancient understanding, wherever you find life, there is soul. So plants have soul in them because they're living things. Animals, the brute animals, have soul in them because they're living. And human beings have soul because human beings are living. So wherever there's life, there's soul. Wherever there's a living body, really, there's soul. Okay? The angels don't have soul, or aren't soul, for reasons we'll get into, because they don't have bodies. So they're not like a physical life form. Where there's a physical life form, there's soul. Okay? Now, that doesn't mean that every soul is the same in kind, so that human beings and grass and like cats and dogs have like the same kind of soul. But wherever there's life, there's soul of some kind or another. And then the question becomes, what's the difference between different kinds of soul?
What is the difference?
Yeah,
Okay.
particularly between an animal and a human. I say, well, what makes a monkey and a human different in terms of soul?
Sure. So Aristotle ends up giving a general definition of soul that became pretty predominant, which was that the soul is the form of life. It's the actuality of life in a body, okay? The first actuality of life in a body, okay? Having life potentially within it, to be technical. So the soul is that which makes the body to live rather than not live. So what's the difference between, let's say, a worm that's living and a worm corpse, right? The corpse of a worm that's dead, the difference is soul. Okay, the soul is what forms the body and animates the body of the worm. And so it is for all up the various forms of life, okay? And then if you start to ask the question, well, what is it that differentiates one soul, one kind of soul from another? Aristotle astutely observes that they have different functions. Okay, different kinds of soul can carry out different activities, different kinds of activities, but they're related in a way that's graded, and each higher order includes the lower, but can do more.
So things don't have multiple souls, but they have the properties of the... Yes,
that's the teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas, but that was a very significant thesis that St. Thomas established in the 13th century, and it was a disputed question for many centuries, let's just put it that way. So whether there's one soul or multiple souls is a disputed question, but St. Thomas says there's one soul per substance, or per living substance, okay? But the way to think about it is that plant souls have a certain number of functions, right? There's nourishment or nutrition. So all plant life carries out nutrition of some kind, and there's reproduction. Okay, so nutrition and reproduction are kind of baseline. Then the next grade up from that is animal souls. Animal souls have nourishment and reproduction, but in addition, they have sensation. And Aristotle points out that all animals have at least the sense of touch. Whether they have the other four senses besides touch varies from one species to the next. But all animals have at least the sense of touch. And then, so that's what's characteristic of animal soul. Now, they also have, he points out, powers of locomotion, so they can move from here to there, whereas plant souls don't move from here to there, or plants don't move from here to there. The human soul is one step up from the animal souls, or the lower animal souls. And that is because the human being has powers of nutrition and reproduction, but also powers of sensation, but in addition to that, powers of reason. And the powers of reason, or the power of reason, is really what differentiates the human being from lower forms of life, and it's what differentiates our soul from lower types of soul. So you get the notion of rational soul,
right,
or spiritual soul, and that's the human soul, properly speaking.
You hear this critique of sort of Aquinas' ideas from like a materialistic perspective. It's like, why do you even need a soul? So, right? Can we just say, what makes a plant a plant is this particular three-dimensional arrangement of matter, and that emergence gives rise to a plant's properties, rather than saying, oh, we got to put this soul on top of the matter or inform the matter.
Right. So that's a really good question. And it, the way that you've asked the question is that you're asking about soul in general. So you're not asking about plant souls in particular, or animal souls in particular, or human souls in particular, but soul in general. So why think there's soul? And if we go back to Aristotle's definition that soul is the form of the body, the first actuality of the body, then you have, in a way, your answer, and everything turns on the term form. So it's often said that the soul is the form of the body. But form, for Aristotle, does not mean what it means for other philosophers, or even, I think, typical contemporary thinkers, okay? Even very often Christian or Catholic thinkers, who are raised in a certain sort of scientific education in which Aristotle's notion of substantial form is left out of consideration.
Right.
So Aristotle knew well of a position called atomism. Atomism is the view that the world consists of these very small particles, indivisible particles, floating in a void and moving by chance. And the atomists understood that things are, items around us in the world, they thought of them as kind of bundles or packages of these atoms, okay? And you can think of them as having a kind of form, okay? But Aristotle would say that's more like an accidental form. In other words, the order that the atoms have one to another is accidental to them as atoms. They can gain or lose that form and still continue to be the atoms that they actually are. So what's really real are the atoms, and the form that they have within a whole is accidental.
Just happenstance. It just happened to bump into that form. And
yes, but also that form can be gained or lost without them ceasing to be what they are. Okay. Substantial form is a different thing from accidental form. Substantial form unites with a principle that Aristotle calls prime matter, a notion that the atomists did not recognize or acknowledge. Substantial form unites with prime matter in such a way that it constitutes the very whatness of the matter itself. So what makes something to be is that which makes something to be what it is, okay? So a substantial form is not accidental to underlying types of matter. It constitutes matter as the kind of matter that it actually is. So what would make gold, for example, to be gold is the substantial form of gold uniting with something more fundamental than gold, a more fundamental kind of matter, or a more fundamental matter, okay, called prime matter. So the way Aristotle thinks about it is that substantial form unites with prime matter to constitute matter itself. So even if you think there are atoms, even atoms are already composed, but they're not composed of smaller quantitative parts. they're composed of different kinds of parts, different metaphysical principles, substantial form and prime matter, to constitute the atom itself. Let me put it this way. Aristotle doesn't have any time for atomism or the idea that the world is a bunch of atoms that are all accidentally organized with one another. It doesn't account for the totality of our experience. So he thinks of ordinary objects in the world, dogs and cats and trees. Each one of them is an irreducible primary substance that has a substantial form that unites directly with prime matter. And that substantial form makes it to be what it is and organizes the material constitution of the whole thing all the way down to the fundament, to the bottom.
Right.
Okay. So when Aristotle says that soul is the form of the body, he means that the soul is the substantial form. It's that which makes the living thing to be living. So to get back to your basic question, which is why I think that there is soul at all, we have to ask the question: do you think that there are living things? Do you think that living things begin to live and cease to live? And do you think that living things are different in kind from non-living things? So if you think there are living things, if you think that living things differ in kind from non-living things, and if you think that living things substantially generate and substantially corrupt, you're going to need to postulate a principle like soul as the substantial form of them in order to account for all those things. And one of Aristotle's objections to atomists, which is kind of what you have in mind, is that their view does not account for those three positions. So contemporary philosophers and biologists often end up in the position there's really no difference between a living thing and a non-living thing.
Right. And there's no difference
that seems
between,
to clash with our experience.
Yeah, no difference between one living thing and another.
Right.
It's just a different arrangement of this underlying
So the
stuff.
idea that there's just a spectrum between forms of living things also follows even when you get down to the simplest kinds of living organisms, and you start to ask the question, what's the difference between the living and the non-living? I've had biologists tell me to my face, well, there's not really. It's just a spectrum there too.
Right. Yeah.
And Aristotle would say nonsense. Our senses tell us there's a substantial difference between living things and non-living things. Living things come to be and pass away. And so you need you need to posit a substantial form that makes them to be living. And that's soul.
To give them that unity.
Yeah. I don't know if that's a lot.
No, that's great.
I wanted to give you a thorough explanation so that it treats all the complexities of the question.
So you talk about the sort of three different, the vegetative, animal, and human soul. Then, as a biologist, I always hear people say, well, life doesn't fall into those categories. There's all these, sort of weird cases, like plants sort of sense light and can move, or a Venus flytrap or something. So how would you, fit that in there? Or does that disrupt what, Aristotle or Aquinas says about the soul?
No. When I have spoken with biologists about what we might call borderline cases, where it's hard to tell where one thing falls. And when you dig down into the material structure of these things, we can still find in things a difference between, let's say, things that are capable of sensation versus things that are not capable of sensation. So when I've talked with biologists about the Venus flytrap, they describe a mechanism for reacting to stimuli that's different from sensation, because it doesn't have any neurological matter. There's no neurons. There's no nervous system within the plant, but the manner in which the plant responds to poking and prodding is with a kind of hydration pumps within the subcellular sort of structures. To use my very
technical biological.
But the biologists I've spoken to said, no, there's definitely a difference between the chemical constitution of these things that tracks with the difference between things that have sensation and things that don't.
Right. Yeah. Particularly that nervous system distinction, because you can say single cells sense in one term of the word,
in one sense, but it's not in a sense that you like. Seeing, tasting, smelling, touching, and hearing sense. And then the question is always, the question raises a bigger question, which is there's like the identities that things have in themselves, their essences, their natures, what they are in themselves versus how we can tell what they are.
Okay.
So identity conditions versus identification conditions. And neither Aristotle nor St. Thomas is committed to the view that we can always tell where things fall.
Yeah.
Okay, it's often very fuzzy. We have to do more research. The answers are yet forthcoming. And there can be mistakes too. So for example, sponges were once classified as plants, but now, if I understand correctly, they're classified as animals.
Yeah.
So it took a couple thousand years of research, but eventually we got clear on that. So the sponges were what they were all along.
Right. Yeah.
It just took us time to sort of catch up with proper understanding of what they actually are. And now we can classify them correctly. So
pretty humbling, and great clarification. That being said, as we're discussing the soul from a philosophical perspective, what are the soul's properties?
If we speak about soul in general, then the first thing soul does is actuate the body or make the body to be living. Okay, so it's the difference between being alive and not being alive. That's the principal thing. That's really what it is. But then it's often pointed out that the soul has additional powers. For example, if a tree is alive, it has the potential to grow and become bigger. It has the potential to have more branches. It has the potential to conduct photosynthesis, for example, if it's the right kind of tree with the right kind of, leaves and whatnot. So soul, you could say, imbues things with potentialities, multiple potentialities for further activities over and above simply being alive rather than not alive. And then if you start to ask, well, what are these further potentialities? That's precisely what differentiates the kinds of soul from one another. So for example, plants have potentialities, powers, sometimes called powers of the soul. They have powers for nutrition and reproduction. If you talk about animals, they have powers of nutrition and reproduction, but they also have powers of sensation and locomotion. They can move from here to there. So they have potentials that become activated in their life according to the different kinds of things that they are. And then human beings have, again, the powers or potential of nutrition, reproduction. We have powers of sensation and locomotion, but we also have power of reason. And the things that are involved in reason, which are understanding and will, intellect and will, or the activities of intellect and will.
What are the soul's causes?
That's a little bit of a complicated question because the soul itself is understood to be the formal cause of the being. Okay, that the formal cause of the living thing. It's what makes the living thing to be living and to have these potentialities for further activity. But then if you ask, well, what's the final cause? It's really the final cause of the whole organism is that life form like fully operational or in its optimal state. So that's the final cause. And the soul is a formal cause that endows the whole organism with inclinations or drives, you might say, inclinations or drives to grow, develop, and carry out its own proper activities until it reaches an optimal state of development and flourishing. So that would be like the final cause. And then we can't talk about, when we talk about like the material cause of soul, we got to be very careful because the lower forms of life, like plant souls and animal souls, the soul is the form of the body. And so it organizes the matter of the body and activates it and makes it to be living. But there's nothing more to those forms than the organization of the matter, or organization and animation of the matter. When you start to talk about the human soul, however, the human soul brings in another measure of perfection, which is that the soul is the form of the body. So it organizes our body and animates our body and makes our body to be living. But the human soul, unlike the souls of plants and animals, carries out at least two of its own proper operations just as soul, carries out the activities of intellect and the activities of will.
Yeah. And
higher knowing and loving.
And those things are tied to the body, but they are something that can't be reduced to the physical causes in essence.
Yes,
right?
That's a fair way to put it. It's tricky. We want to draw distinctions. Yeah. So the powers that the human soul has, just as a soul itself,
right,
are the powers of intellect and will. Intellect carries out a higher kind of knowing, higher than sensation, like higher than seeing, tasting, smelling, touching, hearing, imagining, remembering, or estimating singulars. Well, maybe we can get into that when we see if we talk about the different powers of the soul. There's a kind of knowing we can do that's like a higher kind of knowing. You might think about the kind of knowing we do in math, where we can know the truth for an infinite number of instances of triangles or something like that. The intellect carries out a higher kind of knowing, and the will carries out a higher kind of loving. Okay, so St. Thomas understands the will as essentially our ability to love, and from out of that flows other things that we typically associate with will, but it's really the capacity for love, okay, principally.
Yeah, okay.
So a higher kind of loving beyond just sensory loving or sensory attractions to things. It's the love for things like truth, for goodness in general, for beauty, right? For God. That's will. Now, the activities of intellect and will, knowing and loving, this higher knowing and higher loving, those activities are intrinsically and essentially immaterial. They're spiritual activities in that sense of the term. They're immaterial. So in and of themselves, they are not the activities of organs. They're the activities of the soul itself, which implies that the soul itself has something is more than just the form of the body. It's what's called an immaterial soul in the traditional vocabulary, or it might better be called an irreducible soul. Okay, a soul that's irreducible to being simply the form and animating principle of a body. But St. Thomas is very clear that when intellect and will carry out their higher activities, this higher kind of knowing and higher kind of loving, they cannot do so without drawing upon the sensory powers, which are the activities of organs and activities of the body.
Yeah.
So you and I, if we could not see, taste, smell, touch, hear, imagine, or remember in any way whatsoever, you wouldn't really be able to think. You wouldn't, wouldn't be able to have any higher thinking at all. It's kind of like when you're asleep, right? Or when someone's in a condition of, being knocked unconscious. They can't think or know in this higher way or love in this higher way, enact at that moment, because there's an impediment to them doing so, which is that their lower sensory powers have been taken out for some reason. So the higher powers of intellect and will are intrinsically and essentially immaterial powers and immaterial activities, but they need as a necessary condition for their activity the proper functioning of the physiological powers of sensation.
Yeah, that's great. We've talked about this season about the properties or the abilities that humans have cognitively and so forth, and how some of those seem to, like you said, be immaterial. They can't be reduced to the material. So if someone were to ask you, hey, how would you demonstrate that to somebody?
How do you
demonstrate that, we have these things that can't be reduced to the material? What would be Thomas's answer to that, or what would you be your sort of the best argument that you would have?
Sure. So here's a way to start getting at it that people, I think, can sort of start to think it through for themselves. But the classic distinction goes like this: that all sensation, all external sensation, is of particular things.
Right.
So when you pet a cat, you're petting this particular cat. You see this particular cat, and you touch this particular fur.
Right.
And all sensation, if you think about it, is of particular things. So when you smell and taste a cup of coffee, or smell and taste coffee, you're smelling and tasting this coffee, this particular coffee.
Right.
So all sensation is of the particular. But the ancient philosophers also realized or discovered that this higher kind of knowing is not of particulars. It's of universals. So, for example, when you know the formula for the area of a triangle, you don't just know the formula for this particular triangle. You know the formula for all triangles. In fact, there's an infinite number of them, and you know a truth that extends to an infinite set of triangles.
Right.
So this higher kind, lower sensation is of particulars, but this higher kind of knowing is not of particulars. So it's different in kind. It's a different kind of activity because it's of a different object. The lower sense knowledge, the sensation is of particulars, the higher knowing is not. Now, you got to get that distinction first. If you get that distinction, you get clear on that. And that takes people a long time to get that distinction, because there's a range between being of the particular and being of the universal absolutely considered. There's a range of knowledge in between there that makes things a little bit difficult. But we can clarify that if we need to. But then, to then go further and say that knowing a universal absolutely considered is a different kind of activity that itself requires an immaterial activity of the mind, that we would need another step to that. And St. Thomas has his argument, and his basic argument is that if the universal, if the activity of the intellect were material, it would particularize the received form. So what you're thinking of would be particularized into one thing that you're thinking of. Because matter is always particular,
not a universal. So there is no matter for a universal, right? And so you can't perceive it in a sense. Yeah,
you got it. That's the basic idea.
Yeah.
So Aristotle has a second argument for the claim that the activity of the intellect is immaterial. And I find it a fascinating argument.
Okay.
I just want people to hear it.
Yeah.
It really resonates with our experience. And Aristotle points out that when it comes to physical organs and physiological activity, an excessive amount of the object of that sense damages the organ. So if the object of hearing is sound, but if you hear sounds that are too loud, you go deaf. You might think of someone who hears a very loud boom.
Yeah, right.
And you can lose your hearing. Or if you see light that's
really
too bright,
you can
you go blind. Or if you eat food that's way too spicy, you lose your sense of taste, at least temporarily. So when it comes to physiological organs and their activities, an excessive amount of the object damages the organ. But Aristotle points out when it comes to intellect, its object is truth. And no one's intellect has ever been damaged
too much
by too much truth. You can know like an infinite amount of truth. You can know infinite truth, so to speak, in mathematics. And your intellect is not damaged in any way by it. Yeah, it's not much discussed, but it's kind of fascinating
to contemplate on, definitely. You mentioned the powers of the soul and how, the powers of the vegetative soul differentiate from animals and humans. Anywhere you want to speak to that, especially about what makes the human soul unique when it comes to the powers of the soul?
The human soul is unique for a couple of reasons. The human soul is unique because it has two distinct powers that the lower forms don't have. The human soul has intellect and will, and those two comprise what's sometimes called mind. Okay, so the human soul has mind. It's also called spirit, or it's called the spiritual part of the soul. And that's the main thing that differentiates the human soul from plant and animal souls. Okay, we have mind, we have intellect and will. But because we have mind and have intellect and will, we should also point out that the way that we use even the other powers which we do have in common with plants and animals differ. So, for example, animals and plants, they nourish themselves. They take in nutrients from the world, and so do we. We nourish ourselves. But the manner in which we do so is quite different because we have intellect and will. So animals will eat, but humans dine. We have like meals, and banquets, and
It's like meaning behind it.
etiquette, and there's certain ways that are like
sure.
acceptable to eat, and certain ways that are not, and in decent company. And the same with reproduction. So animals reproduce, human beings procreate. Okay. So there's a difference in the way in which something that's even reproduction, there's a human mode of doing these things, or carrying these things out. And that's because of intellect and will. So what distinguishes human soul from the lower soul is that we have intellect and will. That's the primary difference. Yeah. But that difference also makes a difference throughout our whole being in the way that we exercise even those powers which we do have in common with the lower plants and animals.
You mentioned the mind. This whole season is about consciousness.
Okay.
What is the soul's relation to the mind and consciousness?
Okay, that's a good question. The classic way to understand it in Aristotle and in St. Thomas is that the mind is a power of the soul, or really a twofold power of the soul, intellect and will. Okay. And consciousness, as we understand it, is something of a property that goes with intellect. So intellect is able to take in the forms of things from the world around us and understand them in a universal and abstract kind of way, like we've talked about a little bit. But not only do we think about things, but later on we can remember, hey, I was thinking about this, or I was thinking about that. So we're aware of what we're thinking about. We're aware of our own intellectual activities. And not only do I want this or want that, but later I can reflect, and later on I can realize, or maybe even in the moment, I can realize, wait a second, I want this or I want that. And so thanks to mind and this property it has of consciousness, which is really a being present to oneself, mind is aware of all the activities that are taking place within itself. It's aware of its own acts of thinking. It's aware of its own acts of willing. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's how we have the kind of conscious life that we have, because of mind. But mind is not simply consciousness on the classic understanding. It's this power or potency of intellect, and it includes will, and it has as a property consciousness.
Yeah, because consciousness seems to, it's shared with other organisms in a sense, but they don't have they don't have the ability to reflect on their consciousness.
Reflexive consciousness.
Right? So there's a big difference between, say, what it's again, we think, it seems like my dog is conscious, or that an ape might have some conscious awareness of what's going on around it, but it doesn't have this ability to reflect upon. It's almost like trapped in the moment in a sense.
Right. So like other things that we talk about when we start comparing plants, animals, and human beings, there are certain imitations that kind of go, they're imitations of one order to the next.
Yeah.
And I think that even certainly for animals, there is something that is similar to consciousness, but is not intellectual consciousness per se.
Yeah.
And both Aristotle and St. Thomas talk about this. We'd really have to dig into some of the details about the powers of the soul, talk about sensus communis, but there's a kind of self-awareness that the common sensory power has. So this common sensory power takes in not only the objects of the five senses, but also has a kind of awareness that the five senses are in working order.
Okay. Yeah.
So when you hear things, what you hear enters into your sort of general sensory awareness. But if you were to lose your hearing in one ear for a moment, you'd realize it. You'd notice, wait a second, I can no longer hear in my left ear. That is a function of the sensus communis, or the general sensory awareness that animals and human beings have.
Right. Okay.
So there's a kind of self-awareness there, or maybe a reflexivity, but it's not the same as intellectual reflexivity. Okay.
Yeah.
And then we can talk about the cogitative power, which is another power, like a step up from sensus communis. That's where we can bring in many, many singulars that we've experienced throughout our life, and they kind of fuse into like a generalized experience. So once you start talking about generalized experience that's filled with estimations of whether things are threatening or beneficial, there's also at that level a kind of ability to judge. Is this thing a threat or is it a benefit? And even animals have that. So if you're walking down the sidewalk and there's a bird, the bird just like knows your trouble and like flies away. There's a kind of estimation there and a kind of judgment there. But it's not the same as human judgment, okay, and human estimation of these things. There's similarities and there's differences, and we'd have to really dig into the weeds on what the difference is.
Yeah, and we talked about this in the first episode about, in the sense that like animals have some sense of maybe, of like chimps, you could have a sense of well, that's me in a mirror, recognize that, but they don't have, they really lack this sense of wanting to communicate with other minds and thinking and they can't think about the future and the past, and they don't seem to have that ability for recursive thinking. Like you were talking about, I'm going to reflect on why, yesterday I read this book. Well, what was my purpose? They don't have sort of offline thinking. There's clearly a big difference there.
Sure, and I think that what they do demonstrate in their behavior that's similar to us can be accounted for in terms of the kind of sensus communis they have, general sensory awareness they have, and the estimative power which they have, which will be rather sophisticated by comparison to animal forms beneath them.
For sure.
They'll have a higher measure of estimating threats and benefits, and they'll have an estimative sense that is closer to preparing experience for abstract knowledge.
Right.
And that when you have generalized experience that's kind of suitable or close to being suitable for abstract knowledge, then you're going to have a lot of behaviors in common with or similar to human beings. And what's really going to differentiate our consciousness from that will be accounted for by the kind of awareness we have due to intellect, properly speaking.
Okay. Because I think a lot of times people say, well, animals can do this and that, but you can see that can be explained at the level of...
There is, and we have to be very careful about the difference between a similarity,
right,
okay, and a sameness.
Exactly.
And the same in kind and similar in behavior are not.
Right. And
don't follow
it
from
kind of goes back to the list of things you can come up with.
In discussing the soul, I think a question a lot of listeners and viewers might be, well, what happens when the soul separates from the body?
That's a great question. It's one of the perennial questions of the human race. We all want to know what happens after death.
Mm-hmm.
If you believe that the activity of the higher knowing and higher loving that we talked about earlier, the activities of intellect and will, are immaterial or spiritual activities for the reasons that we gave earlier, or for some other set of reasons, then it would follow that the human soul is irreducible to being just the form of the body or the organizational plan of the body. Mm-hmm. It would not be a material form, to use the language of St. Thomas. So there's something in the human soul, there's something, it has a kind of subsistence of its own that's irreducible to the body. And so when the soul separates from the body at death, the soul is able to continue to subsist or exist on its own without the body. But St. Thomas is also very clear that because the soul is the form of the body, although it's not just that,
right,
because the soul is the form of the body, it's like in an unnatural condition.
Okay, yeah.
For this human soul to exist without the body is a very unnatural state. Mm-hmm. And to motivate this, it's very simple. I mean, if you start to think about amputations, like losing an arm or losing a leg is very unnatural for the people who experience it. Now imagine if you had a complete body amputation where your entire body is removed. Your soul is continuing to subsist, but you would naturally ask, where's my body?
Yeah.
Right? So it's not a natural condition for us to be in. And this is why it's very fitting for us to receive, by the grace of God, the resurrection of the body in the end. So there will be an interim state where the human soul survives after death and awaits the final resurrection, the resurrection of the body, and will be in a more complete condition after the resurrection of the body.
Yeah.
There's this theory I recently learned of that I want to give you the chance to respond to, panpsychism. And it's this idea that the universe is animated by a ubiquitous mind and consciousness, and that even atoms have a small spark of consciousness. Do you have some thoughts on that?
Yes. It's a view that's out there. It's very common in the Far East. It has some defenders in Western philosophy. You can see what motivates it, and that is plants, animals, even the elements seem to display purpose-driven activity or goal-driven activity. They have a kind of teleological activity. So it seems. And this is something both Aristotle and St. Thomas picked up on. But they took that not as evidence that things themselves have mind, for all the reasons we explained. There's different kinds of activities between these grades of soul and whatnot. There's different kinds of activities that really differentiate them from human beings that, properly speaking, have mind. Nonetheless, they display something that's kind of mind-like or looks like intelligent activity. That's not evidence that they have mind, but it's evidence that they are being directed by a higher mind. So this is really the premise for the teleological argument for the existence of God, the fifth way. And so everything in the world, from the atoms up, or whatever the lowest material stuff is, from the lowest material stuff all the way up, all of it participates in a world of wisdom and love, which is ultimately directed by God. So they participate in the divine wisdom, but they are not properly constituted as beings with mind themselves.
Yeah. But they act towards an end.
They act towards an end. Towards an end, yeah.
Yeah. So, thinking about ends and purpose here. So, if the human soul, has these unique properties compared to other souls of intellect and will, what does that shed any light on what is the purpose of human, right? Because clearly that's what makes us unique.
Sure.
So
one of the unique abilities that human beings have, if we could speak this, or one of the unique activities that human beings have because we have intellect and will, is we make free choices. We choose to follow this course of action or that, and I can also always ask you, you did something. Why did you do that?
Right.
And you can say, well, I did it for the sake of something further.
Hopefully I can have a reason for
if it's a deliberate activity, you have a purpose for it. And I go, well, what's the purpose of that? And then what's the purpose of that? Right. And what's the purpose of that? And so we have a chain, so to speak, of purposes or embedded purposes or sequences of purposes. But this chain of purposes, A is for the sake of B, B is for the sake of C, C is for the sake of D, cannot go on infinitum. So there must be some ultimate end for the sake of which you and I act. And then we can ask ourselves, well, what's this ultimate end for which you and I are acting? And the classic answer that was given to us in the perennial tradition of philosophy is beatitude. Everyone's looking for what's really going to make them happy. Everyone's looking for the one thing that satisfies completely. And then if we ask the question, well, what is that? Then we start to get into much deeper and bigger questions. Yeah. But there is this ultimate end. I mean, everybody's living for something.
Right. Yeah.
What are you living for? If you're a human being, you're living for something. What are you living for?
Right. And then the question is, what is it that satisfies?
Right. What is it that's ultimately going to satisfy?
Right.
I know you're a sought-out preacher, and it's obvious why this has been such a gift of a discussion. And
Praise God.
Absolutely. And I want to let our viewers and listeners know how they can find more of your work. Tell us about the Thomistic Institute.
Well, the Thomistic Institute is run by the Dominican friars, and it's designed, its mission is to bring the teachings of the Catholic faith and the theology of St. Thomas, the philosophy and theology of St. Thomas to college campuses everywhere, and to make that truth available to the public at large. And so if you go to, there's a whole network of professors and friars that travel the country and give talks, and all of that's gathered on the Thomistic Institute SoundCloud site. as well as on the Thomistic Institute YouTube site and Aquinas 101. And there's an endless amount of material there for people to go and learn. It's all made available for free, thanks to the generosity of benefactors. And any one of the topics we brought up today, you can find a specific talk by a professor or a Dominican that goes on about that topic at great length and detail.
Yeah, that's great. You also, have a new book out that is sort of a compilation of sort of your efforts over the last decade.
Yeah, so
or
I have a new book out called The Father's House. I've traveled a lot over the last 10 years, preaching a lot of weekend retreats to college students and young adults. And I gathered up all the weekend retreat material into a single book. It's a short little book, not terribly long, available from Pauline Books and Media. It's about our filial adoption. It's the gospel of Jesus Christ. Just sort of presents it all for people. It's based on I call it the three questions, right? What is the purpose of life? The purpose question. Who am I? The identity question. And how do I find love? The love question. And the gospel of Jesus Christ is the answer to all those questions. So I lay that out, and then the second half gets into, well, how do I live this? How do I live according to the gospel of Jesus Christ? I talk about the way of friendship, walking on the way of friendship with Christ in the church, and we're walking together towards the Father's house. So that's what it's about.
Well, thank you for answering those big questions and our big questions here today.
Right,
Father
my
James
joy.
Brent, thank you.
Thank you. Been great to be here.
Yeah, it's great having you.
Yeah.
Well, that conversation gave me a lot to contemplate on, especially about our capacity for truth is really unlimited as well. That stood out to me. What stood out to you, Dan?
Yeah, it's interesting when we're talking about the difference between an animal soul and a human soul with them, because there's a tendency either, hey, let's compress the two, that humans are just another animal and sort of bring them down to that level, or other people to say to push animals down and make humans way up here. And I think it's interesting that, when you look at the powers that he talks about that animals have of cognition, that they have some really cool things that they can do. But that doesn't bring them up to the level of humans. So we can elevate both in a sense. Like animals have very cool properties of being able to make sense of the world, and learn, and some cognitive powers and so forth. And you can see sort of the powers that humans have sort of bubbling there, but not quite there. And then the idea of just, hey, let's list the things that humans do that are unique, and that list gets pretty large pretty quickly. And I think that's a great mental exercise, is to really drive home that, hey, there's something difference in kind between humans and animals, and that doesn't diminish animals in any sense.
And again, some of our powers, for example, I can't lead an orchestra, but there are humans who can have that capacity. I'm
down with the animals with that one.
Exactly. I didn't have the chance to ask them if all dogs go to heaven, but I'll have to have that conversation another time. And I imagine that was really helpful for you as a biologist, and just different conversations you have with scientists in the field as well.
Yeah, that's great. It's interesting. He's had some of the same conversations, the critiques that biologists who are steeped in this evolutionary worldview. And how do you reconcile that with some of the things that we know about the powers of the soul that he's talking about?
Well, speaking of questions and answers, that brings us now to the office hours segment. And this first question we got actually from someone online had this specific question for you, Dan. Pretty big one, but I'll throw it out there. How does one distinguish a purposeful act from a physically causal event? That is, can one choose to do other than what physics dictates? Do you have
that's
an answer for this?
$1 million question
Right.
there. Yeah. The idea is, are we acting with sort of freedom and purpose? Are we just doing what the physics is telling us to do? Do we not have freedom? And I think, is there a way to tell? Scientifically, no. I think the answer, but how do we do that? Well, it's as simple as asking somebody, are you doing something purposeful? What is the purpose behind your activity? It's a sense that we know when we're doing purposeful activity. And that's not to say that it's not influenced by, prejudice, biases that we might have, or, addictions and things like that. But purpose is one of those things that everybody, it's interesting. Father Brent was talking about that in this episode, that we all live our lives with purpose. Like we do things for a reason. There's a purpose behind that. So we either have to say, that's all just an illusion, right? Or, yeah, we do have a purpose, although it is circumscribed because we don't have, the freedom to do everything because of, our, evolutionary psychology, for example, that we've talked about in previous episodes this season. So,
Yeah.
I think from humans, it really comes down to ask somebody, is that purposeful? And do you have a sense of purpose? And that's something that we can know, even though we can't scientifically prove it, right? So the idea that, there's certain things we know that go beyond the science, and that would be one, right? And there isn't, neuroscience is not, tell us, whether we have purpose or not, our actions are purposeful.
Yeah. Okay. So this next question is one, I was curious about. We've been in this Lenten season, and as Christians, it's a time that we're more intentional about fasting. There's also prayer and almsgiving, but with fasting, we know, we believe that there are spiritual benefits to that. But as a biologist, are there physical benefits to that as well?
Yeah, definitely there are. There's clear physical benefits of fasting. There's two that I hit on. One is like if you don't eat, say, for 24 hours, do a day-long fast, your body switches from using sugars to has to rely on ketones. And your brain, in particular, has to rely on ketones. And that leads to, there's studies that show when you're in that state, there's more mental clarity, there's sort of different activities going on in the brain. Kind of makes sense in a sense if we don't have any food, like evolutionarily, you get more clarity trying to find
to survive.
Food to survive.
Right.
But there is clear evidence of that enhances cognition, interestingly. But also, if you're fasting and taking in fewer calories than normal, it tends to shift the body into a state of repair and maintenance rather than growth. And so there's a lot of evidence where you reduce the amount of calories, the body repairs itself, and there's disease prevention and longevity seem to increase there. So there's clear benefits of periodic fasting.
And that seems to go really hand in hand for what we're called to as Christians. If we're praying more during this time and our mind is more clear from fasting, it seems like they'll contribute to one another. And, if it is really this time of our body being repaired, this time of reparation, preparing for Easter.
Yeah, a lot of synergy there between the theology and the biology.
And again, Father James Brent just today telling us how it's only humans who intentionally fast.
That's right. Yeah.
Seems like there's a purpose.
It might be.
Well, with that, I want to remind you all that if you have a question for Dr. Keebler, you can submit it by either emailing us at info@magicenter.com or leave us a voicemail. You can go ahead and call us at 949-257-2436, and you might just hear your question here on Purposeful Lab. Well, with that concludes today's episode. Make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, and we'll see you next week.